Good evening. Welcome, everyone. I'm Amin Sinji, and I'm with the Institute of Politics. Thank you so much for coming out on a snowy evening for our debate tonight, The Role of the Government in the 21st Century, featuring Washington Post op-ed columnist and current IOP visiting fellow E.J. Dionne, and editor of the Weekly Standard and IOP Board of Advisory member, Bill Kristol, two of our nation's most prominent thought leaders. Tonight's debate is part of our ongoing series of forums at the IOP that seeks to elevate and expand the public discourse and dialogue, and to encourage our students to consider careers in public service. Before we begin tonight's debate, I'd like to make you aware of two additional programs that might be of interest. The first, tomorrow morning's 9:30 a.m. breakfast with former Senator Bill Bradley at the IOP House. Our very own Steve Edwards would lead a conversation with former Senator Bradley on his career in the NBA, the United States Senate, and his historic run for the presidency in 2000. Second, E.J. Dionne's final fellow seminar tomorrow afternoon at 4:30, also at the IOP House, where he'll explore what conservatism might look like in a post-Obama world. We encourage you to attend both, should you be interested. Tonight's conversation will be recorded. We encourage you to check us out on iTunes U and also our website at politics.uchicago.edu, where you can find a video and audio, as well as information on our other events. We also will take, as is customary here at the IOP, your questions later in the program. We encourage you to come to the center aisle mic when that time comes, and keep your questions as brief as possible so we can fit in as many as we can, and also to encourage our students to make their way to the microphones first. This evening's program is an exciting one, and to start us off, I'd like to introduce Kiara Nirenberg, a third year into college majoring in sociology with a focus on education policy. She's a leading Board of Executive member of the UChicago Political Union, a student-run organization that runs policy debates, and she will give us our formal introductions. Welcome, Kiara.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Each day, our elected representatives immerse themselves in a plethora of debates on issues of critical importance, from energy and the environment to education and economic mobility. Underlying all of these policy debates, we see another fundamental debate occurring. What role should the government play in addressing these key issues? Here at the University of Chicago, we aim to critically examine not only the issues that face our government, but the role of the government itself. We ponder questions such as, what is the right size and scope of government in our daily lives? Should the federal government play the leading role? Or would a smaller, more limited government better serve our nation? And can the private sector do some things better? Today, we are fortunate to have two distinguished speakers who will use their wealth of experience, wisdom, and divergent perspectives to help us explore these questions regarding the role of government in the 21st century. William Kristol is founder and editor of the Weekly Standard, the influential journal of politics and ideas located in Washington, D.C. He served in both the Reagan and first Bush administrations and is a member of the IOP's Board of Advisors. E.J. Dionne is a twice-weekly columnist for the Washington Post. Before joining the Post in 1990, Dionne spent 14 years at the New York Times. Currently, he is a professor at Georgetown University and a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute. He is also serving as a fellow at the IOP, his final seminar being tomorrow. Moderating tonight's debate is the Executive Director of the Institute of Politics, Steve Edwards. Please join me in welcoming our guests.
Thank you, Kiara. Thanks to everybody for being here tonight. I want you to know that what we're going to do is do a different format, something we haven't tried here at the Institute of Politics, but we think it's fitting given the topic, and we think it's fitting given the two participants who have been great friends and supporters of our program, and as both Kiara and Amin mentioned, are two of the foremost thought leaders and experts on politics today. And that is an Oxford-style debate format. So we've plied both of these individuals with a case each of Red Bull. They have gone through intense physical training to make sure that they can take on the arguments at hand here tonight. And over the course of the next hour or so, we are going to put them through the paces. We'll have constructives and rebuttals. We'll have a little time for cross-examination, and then we'll also open the floor to you for questions as well as they debate the proposition. I think we have a slide here that shows the proposition. So tonight the proposition is anything government does, the private sector can do better. Okay, that's our proposition. I'll also review the format here. Do we have a slide that shows that? And then I'll come back to the vote. We'll do 7 minutes each. Bill first, EJ then, making the case for and against the proposition. We'll give them time to rebut what the other person had said. I'll pose a few questions there for about 8 minutes or so. They will each have a chance to pose one question to each other, and then we'll open the floor to you for your questions about this before we close. So if everyone is set with that, then we'll move back to the slide previously and begin with your participation. So for those of you who have phones on you, smartphone, go to govote.at, enter the code you see on the screen there. Hopefully everybody over there can see it. And select yes or no if you agree or disagree with the proposition. Anything government does, the private sector can do better. And we're going to tabulate your responses to that question now. At the conclusion of this exchange, we will have you go back and share your thoughts at that moment as well. And I should say that what we want now is your opinion on the proposition. What we hope in the end is that you actually evaluate the quality of the argument. So your opinion, we recognize, may not have changed, but we hope that you will give some credence to the thoughtfulness of the ideas and support that both Bill and EJ have brought to the proposition at hand. So without further ado, as you go ahead and vote, I'm going to turn the floor over to Bill Kristol. And as I do, please join me in giving him a warm round of applause. Bill, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Steve. Fellow fans of the private sector. Well, you must be. We're here at the University of Chicago. We're a private university. You're going to go back from here to maybe have a bite on the way home at a privately held and owned and operated restaurant or cafe. You're going to go to your private apartment, I suppose. And many of you probably have private cars. EJ works at, for the Washington Post, a private business, Brookings Institution, which is a private think tank, or not-for-profit, but not part of the government, obviously. Georgetown, another fine private university. So I just assume, if you just you look at people's revealed preferences, that everyone here is a fan of the private sector. But if you want to go to a publicly owned restaurant and run by the University of Illinois and stay in public housing tonight, you can choose to do that. Obviously, this proposition, the proposition that was up there is a little bit cartoonish. I don't think that everything the government does, or anything the government does, the private sector can do better, and nor do I think that everything the government does should be done, should be transferred from the government to the private sector. It's obviously a question of size and scope and reach of government. I'm not an anarchist. I'm not even really a libertarian. I respect Milton Friedman, but I'm not even a Milton Friedmanite. I'm not even a Hayekian. But I will defend. So are you saying we
found the wrong guy?
Yeah, so often the case with, right? But I will defend the proposition that, and EJ, of course, is not as much on the other side as that proposition either. He's not a Marxist, and I'm not a Hayekian. But I will say that the great advantage of Hayek and Milton Friedman and even Ayn Rand, if you want to go to a much more extreme version of a kind of individualist propensity for the private sector, is the great tyrannies of the 20th century were communist tyrannies and national socialist tyrannies, and the great tyrannical threats today merge society and state, society and government, religion and state. And there is a very simple case, but it is a very important case for a limited government. And so the fundamental case for me is a case for liberty, a case for preventing tyranny, even if you could persuade me, which history does not suggest one could, that we would have average economic growth of 3.8% with much bigger government and 3.2% with a smaller government. I would say there are other benefits of smaller government. There are some problems, obviously, with a private sector run amok, and that is why I am not for no government at all. And certainly in foreign policy and in other matters of defense and other matters of common national interest, a safety net, certain basic aspects of the welfare state, I'm totally comfortable with a limited and energetic government. One thing I think those of you who would like a strong government, and I like a strong government in some areas, should think about is it's precisely the fact that government has become so unlimited that has made it ineffective, one of the things that's made it ineffective and unenergetic. the founders describe in the Federalist Papers limited and energetic government. It's energetic if it focuses on a few things. It's energetic if the federal government does some things and states and localities do other things. The kind of sprawling nanny state, welfare state, mixed up marble, cake federalism that we have is not good at accomplishing things. It intrudes much too much and achieves much too little. So I think, honestly, people who believe strongly in key government roles should make their case that government should energetically regulate or even operate certain aspects of society for the sake of those key objectives. But everyone should have an interest in pulling this sprawling, bureaucratic government back, both for the sake of liberty and, I would say, for the sake of energy and efficiency. Why don't I just stop there and let E.J. explain how he thinks the University of Illinois, not the university, but the state of Illinois has been doing great. Public finances are in terrific shape. The city of Chicago, poor Rahm Emanuel. Can I say a word about the election, since I think I have another 2 minutes here? I mean, a big liberal. He tries to come in and be somewhat responsible, save a little, prevent the thing from going totally bankrupt. And this is a big problem with a huge, sprawling welfare state government. So many people then have a stake in it that they won't see their long-term interests. They vote on the basis of short-term interests. It's understandable sometimes, but still, at the end of the day, you get this kind of sprawling welfare state that goes bankrupt.
That is Bill Kristol, affirmative for the proposition. EJ, the negative response.
Well, thank you.
And a round of applause for EJ, I should say, too. Let's keep this fair.
Well, now you know the real reason that Bill is here in Chicago. He is here to sabotage Rahm Emanuel's.
Totally.
You always have to look for hidden agendas.
If you would just, please do tweet out, notorious neocon William Kristol supports Rahm Emanuel enthusiastically. That would be just repayment for Obamacare. Right?
It's always fun actually to debate Bill Kristol. I always say that he is the warmest and most gracious person I know, who also wants the United States to be at war simultaneously with as many countries as possible. And also is determined to stop any efforts to expand health insurance coverage. But it is fun to be with him. Also, this is Chicago, and so I hope that the people in this room will cast at least 200 more votes at the end of this debate than you've cast already. Well, in a sense, I don't have to say anything because Bill has already conceded the core proposition, which is he can't possibly believe that proposition. None of us can possibly believe that proposition. But the question is about our attitude toward government. One of my favorite stories on this comes from Senator Fritz Hollings. And if I could do a really good Fritz Hollings imitation, any of you remember him, this Southern accent, so think if I could do a good imitation, you wouldn't understand a word I said. But Fritz Hollings very famously spoke of a man he had encountered in 1984 who had fought for our country in World War II, gone to college on the GI Bill, started a business with a small business administration loan, bought a house with some help from both the FHA and the GI Bill. His kids, in going to college, had some federal student loans. He drove back and forth to work on interstate highways. His parents were happily retired on Social Security and Medicare. And this person went up to Fritz Hollings and said, "I'm voting for Ronald Reagan to get the government off my back." And I think we really should ponder that story when we talk about what do we think of government. Since I'm talking about Reagan, let's ask the classic Reagan question. He asked, are we better off now than we were 4 years ago? So I would ask, are we better off now because Henry Clay insisted on supporting what he called internal improvements, much better, by the way, than the word infrastructure, internal improvements, roads and canals that bound our nation together and helped make us one market? Are we better off because Abraham Lincoln chose to use the power of the federal government to end slavery and also, by the way, to establish the land-grant colleges? Bill may want to knock the public sector, but I say the University of Michigan, the University of Illinois, every other member of every other member of the Big Ten, which is not 10 anymore, and not even all land-grant colleges, but we are better off because they were created. Are we better off because Teddy Roosevelt decided to pass the Pure Food and Drug Act so that we can know about the safety of what we are taking and that we aren't taking quack medicine that could kill us? Are we better off because Franklin Roosevelt established Social Security because private pensions were insufficient to keep the elderly out of poverty? Are we better off because tens of millions of elderly people who would be poor without Social Security are not poor? Are we better off because Dwight Eisenhower built the interstate highway system? Now, environmentalists in the audience might caveat that and say we should have invested more in mass transit, and I would agree with that. But the fact is that this was an enormous investment in our country. Are we better off because of the National Defense Education Act, which allowed so many Americans, including me, to go to college? Are we better off because Lyndon Johnson passed the Civil Rights Act, because Lyndon Johnson and a Congress with pressure from a great social movement and Dr. King passed the Voting Rights Act as well? Are we better off because of Head Start? And I could go down the list, but I will have to conclude by saying, are we better off because of the Affordable Care Act? And the answer is yes, we are better off. 10 to 13 million Americans who did not have health insurance, would not be insured, have health insurance today. 10 million people have health insurance because of the Medicaid expansion, and many more would if governors now resisting the Medicaid expansion would bring it into their states. Are we better off, by the way, because of the Securities and Exchange Commission, which regulated private markets? And are we better off because after those regulations were weakened in the name of smaller government, we had a great crash, and so we decided to strengthen those regulations to some degree after the crash through Dodd-Frank. I think it's very clear that we consistently, or I shouldn't say we as a country, because I think Americans recognize what government does and how government enables the very private institutions that Bill Kristol is talking about. At the most basic level, without government, there's no enforcement of contracts. Without government, there's no protection against force and fraud. No one actually needs government more than the wealthy who need government's protection. We are better off, the private economy is better off when government acts to spread purchasing power in the economy. We needed a stimulus plan because the private sector, after the crash, was not pumping enough purchasing power into our economy, and the government stepped in to prevent the collapse of the private sector. Senator Bill Cohen, a Republican who later served in the Clinton administration, was talking about the value jet crash. If you remember, it was an airline and it was a terrible crash. People died. And all of a sudden, people who didn't like regulation suddenly said, where were the regulators? And Bill Cohen said, government is the enemy until you need a friend. We need an energetic government. Yes, I'm for limited government, but we need an energetic government because it helps the private sector, it helps all of us, and it especially helps people when they need a friend. Thank you very much.
All right, that's E.J. Dionne. Bill has an opportunity to rebut, so we turn to you for rebuttal to that, Bill.
No, well, I agreed with the first part when E.J. was praising Henry Clay and Abraham Lincoln. That was about, I was on board with that, but 20th century less so. No, I mean, the Fritz Hollings example is very good. If government helps the private sector, helps private institutions, both for profit and not for profit, helps civil society, there are lots of important things government can do, but obviously government's gone way beyond that, and E.J. epitomized it in his last sentence: government can be your friend. I don't really think government should be your friend. Look at the Fritz Hollings examples. World War II, obviously that was a great achievement of the U.S. government, partly done because Roosevelt resisted the urgings of many of his left-wing advisors to nationalize all the war industries and in fact unleashed this amazing American industrial might, which helped us defeat obviously Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. The GI Bill gave people money to go to a university of their choice. I'm for the land-grant colleges, but the land-grant colleges are run really as quasi-private, not really governmental institutions. I mean, I was on the Board of Visitors of one. They're very careful not to let the governor just pick up the phone and fire a professor or get someone into that college. So in fact, the fact that they mimic private institutions is what makes American public institutions, I think, effective and worthwhile often. The loan to start a private business, the loan to buy a private house, driving private cars on public highways, those are all examples of the public sector in a subordinate role to civil society, to private enterprise, to individuals, families, communities, choosing their own fate. It's not government as the nanny state. Now, obviously, we could differ on some of these particular programs. Medicare, incidentally, too. Medicare famously lets people pick their own private doctor and private hospital, and then it reimburses, and there are problems with the system. It is precisely the latter. Head Start, all the evidence shows, doesn't work very well. In fact, this is one of the most studied government programs, and there's no evidence that it works, unfortunately. The Affordable Care Act, Medicaid expansion, in fact, is when government oversteps the line of facilitating private sector transactions, helping provide a safety net, helping people do things better on their own, and government steps in and starts trying to run and regulate everything, and it actually turns out very poorly. So I think EJ has made my case for me.
All right, and EJ, your rebuttal.
I think that Bill has a habit of taking anything good the government has done and redefining it as a private endeavor. There would be no public universities without the government. He has said, it was really good to hear him say how much he likes Medicare and how it guarantees choice to consumers. So I am expecting him before this debate is over to endorse single-payer health care. Because by his definition, single-payer health care is actually private health care. The problem Bill has is these terms that he uses over and over are really vague. The problem with really big government. Well, what exactly does that mean? How big is our government compared to governments in the Scandinavian countries or in Northern Europe? Do those countries with bigger governments nonetheless have very vibrant private sectors and very vibrant capitalist economies? And the whole argument the whole problem with rhetoric about big government that he keeps using in order to avoid the central proposition, because he knows the central proposition is absurd, is that, try this as an example. Imagine a country that has a very small government, no social welfare, no aid to education, no aid to the elderly, but happens to have a very large secret police force that does not permit free speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, but has a really small government in every other respect. And then imagine a country that has a rather large government that does provide for social welfare, that does guarantee a decent retirement, that does help kids go to college, provides job training, but also provides for free speech, for freedom of the assembly, for freedom of the press. Where would you want to live? Which government is oppressive and which government is the friend of freedom? And it's quite obvious that conservatives over and over again like to use this vague big government rhetoric because they want to evade at every single point almost everything our government spends its money on. And if they really think the measure of this proposition is the size of government, the percentage it takes of the GDP, then they would rather live in that dictatorship that has no welfare state and no social supports than in my perhaps social democratic country that guarantees absolute freedom and a degree of economic security.
All right, so let me jump into some moderated questions here during this section of debate. Let me just pick up on what EJ had to say, Bill. I mean, what is wrong with big government?
It does, in fact, stifle economic growth. There's a lot of evidence of that from Europe. There's a lot of evidence of that from the state of Illinois, if I could say. I mean, entitlements are nice, and then it turns out that the demand for entitlements goes up, and it's hard for taxpayers to resist because everyone starts getting on some form or another of government support, and then you have a crisis, as you have in this state. So Look, of course, I'm against dictatorships. One problem, but it's very facile, and I think shows a real lack of familiarity with many, many great thinkers from Tocqueville on, from before Tocqueville and after Tocqueville, to simply blithely say it's great to have this big government that can do all these wonderful things for us, and it also, as EJ puts it, provides freedom of speech. Does government provide freedom of speech? I think government protects freedom of speech. And a big government that can do everything for you is a big government that can take everything from you. Obviously, I don't have an artificial, you can have a decent country that has 30% of the government, taking 30% of GDP. You can have a horrible country with government taking 10% of GDP. On the other hand, what we're debating as a practical matter is the US is at around 20%. That's sort of where it's been. President Obama, at the height of the stimulus and Obamacare coming in, took it to what, about 25%. A lot of social democrats would like it to be a little bigger. A lot of us would like to see it reduced. There are I can give EJ a whole roster of cuts. And the final point about the wealthy, it's precisely big government that becomes crony capitalism. Dodd-Frank, the big banks love Dodd-Frank. The community banks hate Dodd-Frank. Are you in favor of liberating the small community banks, which had nothing to do with the financial crisis, nothing to do with the financial crisis, from the unbelievable regulatory burdens of Dodd-Frank? Citibank can handle those burdens. It's the local banks and someone who might want to start a bank and someone who might want to make loans to his neighbors to help them buy houses who can't handle the regulatory burdens of Dodd-Frank.
Let me also follow up with a question just that gets to the title of this event about the proper role of government in the 21st century, because the proposition is deliberately provocative, but there also is this question in a changing global economy, also in changing institutions, and I'm going to get to that in just a second, and the role that and the degree of faith that the public has in institutions about where government should properly play to ensure that the United States is providing successful in the 21st century. How would you define that question? I'll turn it back to EJ as well, but I'll stay with you, Bill.
I mean, I don't know that the rules of the general laws of politics are that different in the 21st century from the 20th century. I think the 21st century suggests that with more international competition, government can be more of a burden. But EJ and I probably agree somewhat on this. Neither of us, I think, are unabashed fans of globalization or let markets work their will. And therefore, I'm happy, in fact, to have government. I'm something of a nationalist, so I'm happy to have the U.S. government watch out for U.S. citizens and not simply throw them to the wolves on behalf of multilateral corporations. In this respect, I'm not maybe a typical Republican, and I think EJ, as I say, might agree with this to some degree. So in that respect, I am for a strong and energetic government. But what we have now is not that. It's not that. The government isn't doing a good job of preventing the big corporations from running over people. The big government and big corporations are working very cheerfully together to basically benefit each other, and an awful lot of little people are not doing very well.
Yeah, what about that idea? And I also want you to take the central question around the proper role. What about that idea that government is working best at times for large corporations and not actually creating an environment for the little guy, as it were?
Well, first of all, the notion that big banks love Dodd-Frank would come as an enormous surprise to the big banks and all the lobbyists they've hired to try to chip away and chip away and chip away at the provisions of Dodd-Frank. So I do not think that Dodd-Frank is a pro big bank proposal. There is an interesting debate to be had about whether you want to use antitrust to break up big banks, which is actually an interesting left-right kind of proposition. But I think the notion of regulation, the need for regulation, is very clear. And again, when Bill, I just want to underscore the Bill didn't really want to deal, he uses the big government rhetoric, but he didn't want to deal with the core point I made, which is, of course, I believe he does not want to live under a dictatorship. I believe we both support the guarantees and protections of the First Amendment. But the big government rhetoric just aligns right by that, because the state I described, the small government utopia that happened to have a very repressive regime, states like this have existed in history. And I say that a regime with the constitutional protections and a fairly big government are actually good regimes, and regimes that people are happy to live under. We have been, for a long time, a mixed economy country, and we've been believers in balance. That I think there are very few Americans that I know of who would want government to take over everything. There's no progressive, for that matter, there is no democratic socialist in the world right now who wants government to assume control of everything. What people who support what we call liberal, what in Europeans may call a social democratic view, are people who say that there are certain things we need to do in common because they will not get done by the private sector, and we will not do them alone. There are certain investments that we can make in common in public goods that we need, that a private economy needs, that we cannot do alone. And yes, there are certain investments that the government needs to make to help people who end up on the wrong side of the economy at any given time. And I think globalization presents real particular problems to a capitalist economy. If you look around our nation, there are hundreds of thousands of once well-paying blue-collar jobs that are gone. We have added 1 billion or 2 billion people to the global workforce, even as we have undercut the bargaining power of American workers at the same time. And in that circumstance, we do need responses from government, because the market alone is not going to create the kind of broad middle-class society that allows democracy and freedom to prosper.
EJ, what are the kinds of things that you want to see government do under those circumstances?
All right, but I would start with the following list. I think that we need new approaches to guaranteeing people access to both job training and higher education. I'm sympathetic to the president's proposal for 2 years of free community college. It's actually a Rahm Emanuel plank as well. I think a lot of progressives are for that. I think we need to find other ways of stretching out loans, forgiving loans, and the like. I think we need to do far more than we do to guarantee decent child care to everyone. If you look at the opportunities that wealthy families have in terms of the care of their children and the investments they can make in their children versus the opportunities that lower income people have, they are radically different. And we are allowing this generation's worth of inequalities grow much more severe. I've been plugging Bob Putnam's new book that comes out in a couple of weeks called Our Kids, subtitled The American Dream in Crisis, and here is where I will say one hopeful thing about where somehow or other Bill and I might be able to work together. You know, it does seem to me that if you care about inequality, you have to care about what's happening to the family. You have to care about the opportunities kids get from the moment they are born. And that means I think we can have a constructive conversation with our conservative friends who care about the family, but you can't have that family conversation unless you are willing to acknowledge the damage being done to the family by all of this economic change when people discover that they lack the income to live a decent life. And so if you are for social justice, you have to care about the family, but if you care about the family, you have to care about social justice. And I hope after this very polarized period, we might have a conversation that focuses on, and I've only listed a couple of things. The other thing I care a lot about, you know, are family-friendly workplaces, which I don't think the private market will do all by itself.
Let me let
But
Bill...
I just want to say, I'd like to have a discussion as a nation of things that we might find we could do in common to end this scourge of growing inequality, because we are going to allow inequalities to replicate themselves across generations.
Bill, I want you to weigh in on that, and specifically the references to things like government-supported attendance at community colleges, childcare, things like that go at the heart of the agenda the president's been talking about and income inequality questions from his perspective.
I mean, I actually looked at Bob Putnam's book too, and it's some useful data in it, and I don't disagree with most of it probably. It is very typical, however, that Bob Putnam calls his book Our Kids, you know, sort of like they're all our kids, you know. How about my kids and your kids, you know? And then there are common goals. We're all fellow citizens, not really our kids, I wouldn't say. I want to make one other point and then that's the question. Look, conservatives for 70 years, 80 years, and conservative economists, and I say this at the University of Chicago, it's so obvious, have been well aware of market failure, have thought a lot about how to deal with it. We can then argue about whether they deal with it aggressively enough or how you should deal with it. The truth is, and this is a great contribution of so many people here, Gary Becker and others, what people hadn't thought about for a long time, and I've got to say, EJ's rhetoric distressingly doesn't even make a nod to it, is government failure. You know, there is public choice there. There's an awful lot of work that's been done that suggests why government programs don't work the way they are supposed to, how regulatory agencies get captured, the inadvertent consequences, unanticipated consequences of public policies, et cetera, et cetera. And it would be good if liberals had as much sense that government programs can be problematic. I do think most conservatives these days, except for really a few, you know, rabid believers that the market's always perfect, will appreciate that there are market failures, insufficiencies of markets, times when government has to step in and do more than step in, actually shape and guide the society in certain fundamental ways. So we don't disagree that much, I think, in some of those respects, but it would be nice if EJ acknowledged some government failures. What was your question? Inequality? Or,
yeah, it had to do with some of the points that EJ was making around free tuition, community college,
tuition. I mean, that is my
child
view.
care.
I wouldn't offend anyone here. Free tuition at community college is now like a parody of big government liberalism. Having run out of actual serious things they could ineffectually try to spend money on, like, I mean, at least helping people purchase health insurance is a reasonable goal. There are many good, better conservative ideas about how to do it, I believe, but that's a reasonable goal. We already have mostly government-run community colleges. States and localities can set the fees for those as they wish. You can already get Pell Grants to go to them. You can get guaranteed student loans to go to them. It's just demagogy to say, let's make them free. What does free mean? Someone's paying for them, and a lot of the people who are paying for them are people who don't go to college. And why should some truck driver subsidize someone else to go to, I mean, we already are subsidizing them through all the loans and grants and taxpayer revenues that are going to community colleges. I have no real problem with that. It would be nice if some of them were accountable, on the other hand, for the success rates. It would be nice if we didn't just have more and more of them, and if they had some kind of, as I say, market test, which whatever you think of the private sector, there is this kind of tough test, and institutions go out of business unless they can get government to bail them out, which is another aspect of big government that's unfortunate. And the problem with the public sector is once it's set up, there's a state legislator who represents that community college, and it never goes out of business, even if the need for it is not there. I believe we've just seen this in the city of Chicago with poor Rahm Emanuel trying to rationalize the public school system after all these decades. So I do not think, if liberalism's agenda is free community colleges for 2 years, where the average cost of a community college, I think for each student is $3,000, and anyone who's doesn't have money can get a loan or a grant to go to that college, I'm really not impressed by the force of liberalism's big government agenda.
Let me ask each of you very quickly. Did you want to jump in really quickly?
Well, I just want to make three quick points. One, free community colleges has to be part of a larger agenda to make college affordable for people. It's not just about free community colleges. Bill said, well, a truck driver is paying for somebody who isn't going there. You can follow that logic all the way down and say, let's end public education altogether. Let's end subsidies for public education. I think the intuition behind the free community college idea is that at this moment in history, people are actually going to need more schooling or training in order to get decent jobs in the economy. Bill raises the issue of
where's the reform of the Pell Grants and the guaranteed student loan programs that have driven up higher ed costs so much?
Well, I think that I think the reforms in the Pell programs have actually cut out the banks and actually made them better for kids. But I just want to make the other point is Bill raises the problem of government failure. All human institutions are flawed. However, we tend to talk about the flaws in government and we don't talk about the flaws in the private sector nearly as much. Why is that? Because in a democratic country, government is publicly accountable. In the private sector, you fail, you go out of business, you start over again. We have no tolerance in government for experiments that fail. And I think we do need a more experimental approach to government where I do not have a problem with ending programs that don't work. One issue I hope we agree on is how crazy our farm subsidy program is, for example. But if we have to respect the role of government in making our society better, in order to have an experimental government where we try things, it's the old FDR line, let's try something, and if it fails, let's try something else. But the anti-government rhetoric we hear over and over again leaves no room for experimentation because it leaves no room for failure.
Yeah. Well, let me let each of you pose a question to the other, and then I want to go to audience questions as we move this along. So I'll let EJ pose a question to Bill and then in return. So EJ, what would your question be for Bill as we think about the proper role of government in society today?
I am tempted to sort of ask him a question that talks about how much more money he wants our government to spend on the military, but I'll put that aside and
I'm
just
happy
ask,
to answer that. Sure.
Yeah, I'll put that aside and ask, so if you don't like this big government so much, give me a serious list of things you would have us do without in the public sector that really would make this government substantially smaller.
I actually want to first say how much I want to increase defense spending by. I've been writing about that recently. We are radically underfunding our military, I believe. And Bob Gates, President Obama's defense secretary, in President Obama's 2012 budget, said this year we would have to spend about $610 billion, which is not much, 4% of GDP, 4.5%, on defense to have be able to basically maintain our world role, which is a very important one. And if sequester hits, we're going to spend $497 billion. President Obama proposes more. I agree with him on this. I'd go higher than he is, but at least he's willing to bust the sequester on defense. He also wants to do so on domestic policy. Here's what I do think. We've had 20% of GDP being spent by the federal government for an awful long time, and I don't have a radical view that it should be much lower. And I think given the aging of society, Medicare, Social Security, et cetera, it's probably not going to get much lower. I would much prefer if we were spent more simply and cleanly through programs like Social Security, which mail checks out and do a pretty good job of doing that. It can be tweaked to make the entitlement growth less dramatic and more affordable. And I really think it would be healthy for the country to go back to a much more decentralized and federalist system with a separation of the federal and state roles. And let's just decide if the federal government's going to do health care, let it do health care. Let the states do education. Let the states do a lot of other things. Let localities do more. I do think the current system has the worst of all worlds, with people trooping to Washington, local councils getting together to go to the state to lobby them, and then they lobby the federal government. There are 19,000 layers of bureaucracy. The actual accountability really does go away, I think. There is quite a lot of accountability in the private sector, actually. Bad managers get fired. Here, you don't know who's responsible for what. I came to Washington to work in the education department, and it has exactly that character. The federal money goes to the states, which goes to various subcontractors, and who knows what. You get less experimentation. You get less experimentation, not more. Everything is encrusted. This is even true of NIH, which, let's say, is a bipartisan program. I have no problem with spending a lot of money on research for diseases. But when you get it in a big government context that we now have, and an interest group context that we have now, you tend to get the lobbyists for every disease, ensuring that that amount is spent, the same amount or plus is spent on every disease the next year, regardless of whether it says needs as much research as some other. Then if there's a new disease, if it's lucky, I hate to put it this way, and it becomes sort of a popular cause, and then this huge spending source for it, and some other disease that doesn't have a famous person who's afflicted with it, doesn't get the spending. That's how politicized decisions are made. It would be healthier if more decisions were less political.
What about the core element of this question, though, things that you think the government should stop doing?
I think the federal government could get out. I mean, most of the K through 12 education stuff is pointless, and it just shuffles money around, or it hasn't had a good effect. No Child Left Behind has not worked, in my opinion. There's zero evidence that it's improved education, and I would trust localities and parents to make more decisions. And if we were going to, I'm all for supporting poorer parents to give them more choice, and I would do it through vouchers and charter schools, not through No Child Left Behind.
And your question for EJ, what would it be?
I guess, which government programs would EJ, of the $3.7 trillion of federal government spending we now have, which part would you like to cut?
I don't have to answer that question because of the side of the proposition I'm on. I will take it up, but I just want to make the point that where Bill started, which is if he doesn't really want to cut very much in a serious way from the government, first, you have to vote for my side of this proposition. But secondly, he has to stop attacking the big, bloated federal government, because you just heard from him that most of the things that big, bloated federal government spends money on, and by the way, Social Security and Medicare are two of the biggest things, and he wants to increase defense spending, then he's just got to stop talking like that and find a new thing to argue about. He can spend his time arguing about how much he wants big government to spend on defense until he's blue in the face. But he doesn't really believe what he says, or he doesn't mean what it sounds like. Maybe it's a different language when he keeps attacking big, bloated government. When I look at what government should, what I'm really tempted to say is let's cut the defense budget.
Even you won't be that irresponsible.
No, but I sure would want to cut the Bill Kristol defense budget. I already mentioned an area. I am skeptical of programs that subsidize very wealthy people, of which I think the farm program, as it's currently constituted, is one of them. But why do we have a big farm program? We have a big farm program because if we didn't have it, there wouldn't be the votes there to provide food stamps for people who really, really need them. Talk about a program, by the way, that has actually achieved its end in a very efficient way and enhances our economy. But the short answer is I do not have a big, long list of things I would cut. I would like to cut healthcare costs, and we have actually cut healthcare costs since the passage of Obamacare by about $110 billion. I think we need better ways of delivering healthcare. And so if you want to talk about it in terms of balancing our budget, I think dealing with the healthcare inflation is the way to do it. But I have no long list of programs I want to cut.
All right, let me go to questions from you in the audience. You can line up here behind the microphone. We ask that you make your question a question, in fact, that you keep it short and to the point. We will try to prioritize some student questions in this exchange as well. And yes, Stephen.
I'd like to recontextualize two of the terms that Mr. Kristol used, big government failure and my kids or our kids. And I'm thinking in terms of big government failure in terms of the war in Iraq. And it wasn't my kids, it was our kids who had to go over there and who were suffering now that they'd come back. So you were kind of glib with that kind of thing. I mean, but the question I want to ask you is, since you seem to believe in wars, I don't care about military spending, in wars, if your side gets back in and they asked you, like, what would be the first 5 wars that you would want to fight, and why would they contribute to our freedom, and why would they be not another big government failure?
I think one thing government, and only government could do, is stop Iran from getting nuclear weapons, which I think would be a disaster for the Middle East and a disaster for the world. It would lead to nuclear proliferation. It would probably lead to the use of nuclear weapons, which there has not been for 70 years, partly because we have had an aggressive and strong foreign policy that has deterred, I think, other countries from getting nuclear weapons. We've made mistakes, obviously, but we managed to win the Cold War, and a lot of people are free as a result. And so that would be my priority, would be stopping Iran from getting nuclear weapons.
Next question. Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you both very much for being here. Elliot Geiser, a student at the law school. I'm curious for both of our debaters tonight, given the fact that we're fairly broke, and even if you confiscated every piece of wealth of everyone who makes more than $250,000 a year, you wouldn't be able to fund the unfunded liabilities that our generation is going to be picking up. What kinds of reforms could we make in the long run that would actually do something to reduce the fact that we're broke? I mean, and I take that as a given, and I don't know anyone who's serious who actually disputes the fact that we have more unfunded liabilities than dollar bills that would reach to the moon and back.
See, I disagree with the proposition entirely. I do not in any way think we are broke in this very rich country. What unfunded liabilities are you talking about? Yes, there are states that have taken on pension burdens. The state has to deal with them. My own view, by the way, of the pension issue is that in many cases politicians wanted to disguise wage increases they were giving, so they threw it off on the next generation, and also politicians weren't willing to front the public money they needed to keep pension funds solvent. So yes, there are particular problems, but as a nation, will we be able to pay Social Security in the long run? Yes, we will. The Social Security can go on unchanged for many years without ever going into the Social Security fund. We have to make up for a period of time, because there's so many of us baby boomers, about 25% of that. There are plenty of ways to do that. Hiking the ceiling on the Social Security tax, which is a fundamentally unfair tax, could cover the cost of doing that. What we forget about is we were in massive debt at the end of World War II. And what happened? We pursued government policies that allowed the private sector to grow, that allowed people to advance themselves and get wealthier through the GI Bill, thereby paying more in taxes. And we started paying down that debt. And I have to say that we actually had a surplus when the previous administration took over the federal government. We're not broke. We're a rich country. We have certain obligations. We do, again, have to deal with healthcare costs. But I don't think we are broke, and I think it misleads us if we use, with all due respect, I understand what you're saying, but I think it's the wrong way to look at the United States of America.
Bill, what's your response to the same question?
Well, I'm glad that Chicago Law School is still doing a very good job of educating young people. You should probably be up here instead of me, since you probably are a fiercer opponent of big government. No, look, rich people with lavish lifestyles can go broke. And the fact that they're living very well and that they maybe can continue to get people to float their loans for a while doesn't mean they can't go broke. I agree that after World War II, we had a pretty good, we came off, obviously, other people were destroyed, other countries were destroyed. We had this fantastic industrial base, people coming back into the workforce, obviously, from the war. And we had 20 years, 25 years of great growth. The average government percentage of GDP that government was taking during those years was considerably less, though, than today. It was before the modern big welfare state, regulatory state. Government did mostly restrict itself to precisely the things EJ mentioned at the beginning: GI Bill, interest highways, very kind of hard-nosed investments in people and in infrastructure without telling people, without over-regulating whole areas of the economy like healthcare and higher ed, and without throwing all this money into higher education, which has led to a huge spiraling of higher ed costs. So I'll be happy to take the 45 to 65 model in terms of size, scope, and aims of government, mostly.
I just want to say that Bill has endorsed Medicare already, and if you look at costs now and in the future, Medicare and health is the big piece of it. And either you want government to help people have health coverage or you don't. But I think it would be catastrophic if we repealed the guarantees of Medicare, and I think it will be a real problem if we don't ensure that people have health insurance. And I think the only way to begin to contain these costs is to spread the number of people, increase the number of people in the system, and we are already seeing some positive effects from that.
Next question. Yes.
Kind of on a similar note, my question is one of those tell me why I'm wrong questions. So at least when I'm looking at these charts that people always put forward and why big government or small government's better when you look at GDP and all these other factors of good things that happen, when you start looking at the 1950s to present, when you look at all these trends, the one thing I can't help but notice is that when government started getting really large and all these benefits were being accrued, that was when the United States was the last country standing. The whole industrialized world was bombed to cinders at the end of World War II. Likewise, when people say, oh, the Reagan Revolution and Republicans and the small government has led to economic decline, I look at Germany and Japan finally being economies, well, back then, number 2 and 3. So I guess the question, and then last part on debt is our ability to spend and afford the government we have right now inherent in us being the United States, or inherent of this special situation, again, we occupy as being the reserve currency of the world?
I don't quite get
I'm not quite sure
what the ask is at the end of the question.
The question, I guess, is is a lot of the benefits that's accrued from big government because big government works, big government, because it works, or because we have been uniquely placed in history in a time when we could financially afford it, when we could build refrigerators at $25 an hour and send them overseas to countries they can't build their own fridges?
Yeah, is it the model of the circumstances?
If I think there are two things here. The first half, I think I agree with some of your analysis in the sense that at the end of World War II, when many of our competitors were bombed to smithereens, we had a kind of power in the global economy. I think we had, if I remember right, somebody, smart University of Chicago person, correct me, I think we had about 50% of the world's GDP right after World War II. And yes, you did not have the same kind of global competition for labor. So it was, because you had a smaller number of people in the labor market, people could bid up wages, and we had a strong labor movement. So we do face new challenges now. The question in the second half of what you're saying is the suggestion there's a kind of American decline inherent in the second half of it, that we will never have anything like that America. And I just don't see that. If you look to the end of the 1990s, where we were as a country in 2000, both in terms of our global influence and in terms of our economy. We are still a very strong country with a very strong economy, with a very skilled people, and we still have millions and millions of people in the world who want to come here. Our companies are very strong relative to the rest of the world. Our economy came out of the Great Recession better than almost any country in the world. So I am not, I think our situation is different. We face new challenges, but I'm not a pessimist about the long term of the United States. It's actually fun to argue with a conservative and say, I am against the idea of American decline, because I am.
Bill?
I am too, and I'm also for doing things to stop it, which is also necessary, obviously. Look, I think you're trying to get to a bigger, maybe say step back and let's look at the other end of the telescope. And I very much, I guess, let me make this point in a way it's almost so simple I probably should have made it at the beginning. Does any serious person believe that if you went to a very poor, at any time in the last 40 years, if you were called in to advise the government of a very poor country with struggling people, really struggling at starvation and all that, and if you said, here, you have two choices, kind of big government, some kind of democratic socialism, more benefits for people, or basically a market-oriented economy. Not without a safety net, not without regulation, but basically go in a market direction. Does any serious person think that you should have said, go in a more democratic socialist direction? Is that the right? I mean, do we not think that hundreds of millions, maybe a billion plus people are out of poverty today because China and India pivoted in a market direction in 1978 and 1991? Do we really believe that South Korea and all the Asian miracles are not real when they went basically in a market direction? Doesn't mean you can't have a decent sized government, doesn't mean you can't have a safety net. Those countries are more kind of crony capitalist than I would like. That's partly because of their circumstances. But I think in the fundamental question of do markets produce prosperity for more people, is it markets that have really helped one of the great moral achievements of the last half century? People who, when EJ and I were in college, were thought to be on the verge, and were on the verge of starvation. A lot of famous people predicted that there would be famines in India, and China was coming out of this ghastly slaughter under Mao, and total poverty and near starvation. Well, not near starvation. Does anyone seriously think that going in a market direction wasn't the right thing morally for those countries? So I think if you step back, you can quarrel about this program or that program, but it's hard to make the moral case, I think, that markets have not been an incredibly beneficent thing for hundreds, billions of people across the world over the last decades and a couple of centuries.
Let's take two last questions here, just in the interest of time, and you can fold any thoughts there. Yes,
yeah, so my question to Bill. So if you envision that ISIS will take part of Iraq territory, and it will be very painful negotiations with Iran, which is obvious, would you argue that we should, and you want to have war anyway, so would you argue that it should be war with Iran?
I would argue that I tend to think that using military force to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons is better than allowing this regime to get nuclear weapons. I tend to believe that intervening in Syria would have been better than letting 250,000 people be killed in Syria and letting that spill over throughout the Middle East. And now we have ISIS slaughtering people, and we seem to think that maybe we can do 6 or 8 bombing runs a day. So we are at war. We are at war. If you have an objection to war, you have an objection to what President Obama is doing now. But maybe if we're fighting, we should actually fight effectively.
No, instead of war in Iraq, that's partially responsible for ISIS. We have war in Iran in the same time, and now we would not have both problems, nuclear weapons and ISIS.
I don't agree with that. The one time Iran stopped its nuclear program was when they were scared after 2003 that we might do something to them, and they stopped for 2 years, and Gaddafi gave up his nuclear weapons and so forth. But we can endlessly debate the Iraq war and other things, and this isn't the place for it.
Yes, sir.
I don't blame Bill for not wanting to debate.
I am happy to debate it. I will come back. You invite me back for a serious debate. And this is important to have because, honestly, people are being unserious about the world because they think they can say Iraq war, and everyone's going to go, oh, my God. Well, we just have to accept a world in which 250,000 people are slaughtered in Syria. ISIS goes berserk and slaughters people. Iran gets nuclear weapons. Putin invades Ukraine because, hey, the other argument's Iraq war. So why don't you sponsor a serious debate on it?
And we have. What would you
and who
do?
Was on the pro side?
Well, we've had Gary Seymour here. We were talking about
Gary
Iran.
Seymour. He was not. Yeah.
No, but
have someone who actually. I like Gary, but I mean he's on EJ's side of this stuff.
Yeah. But tell me, since you want to stay here in this space
I'm
for a
glad
little
Bill
bit.
continues to grow our government as this debate.
No. Let's hold this.
I'm for an energetic government.
So no, but to stay with this. So
incidentally, let me make a point about this. And here EJ and I would agree. I said military, I mean, you could, incidentally, defense infrastructure has been good for a lot of good researchers come out of defense, and I think we might agree, that part of big government, we might agree on a little bit. I still think it should be contained and reviewed and made accountable. One of the things I think that's underestimated, if you believe in helping upward mobility, it is not a bad idea to actually let people have a bigger armed services, because it's always been a historical route for people to have upward mobility in a country like this. And I tried to make this case in the early Bush administration on kind of liberal grounds, and Don Rumsfeld wasn't interested, and he wanted to cut the Army, and so he did so. But anyway, it's a separate issue. The greatest Keynesian success story, isn't this conventional Keynesianism, was the military buildup right before World War II. So.
All right, well, let's get to this question, actually.
Mr. Crystal, during your actual speech, you talked about the government's role in facilitating the private sector, and I understood that at the time to be something of the order of incentives, but later during the end of your questions, you talked about the problem of regulatory capture and of government failure that seemed to be about incentives. So my question is, if not incentives, what would government facilitating the market look like so as to avoid those problems?
Well, no, I mean, look, this is much discussed. I mean, the incentive problem is a problem. Then so you try to help poor people, and you provide a disincentive, perhaps, for work. But now people have given this a lot of thought, and I think there are ways to structure welfare programs and benefit programs so as to try to avoid the notch that provides a disincentive. If that's what you're asking about, there are ways to structure government programs that mitigate or minimize perhaps the risk of regulatory capture. But no, I mean, EJ is perfectly right when he says every human program has failings, and it's unfair. You can't just say because it might go wrong, we're not going to do it. I actually agree with the experimentation point. I would really argue that in a way you have better ability to experiment if you have a skeptical attitude towards government. Citizens will let you experiment with government programs if they think the people who are experimenting will actually close down half of them after 5 years and say these half worked and these half didn't work. If citizens think that the experimentation is just an excuse for setting up endless or permanent government programs, I think then you get the kind of occasionally simple-minded anti-government rhetoric that EJ objects to. But it's simple-minded, but it's understandable because they never see anyone actually saying, let's close down some program, and then if I can praise Rahm Emanuel one more time to truly doom him here in 6 weeks. And so someone like Rahm comes in and tries to close down. Anyway, I'll leave it.
Well, let me actually pose, I'll pose one final question to each of you as we close, as part of the framing for the closing statement. But EJ, I want to pick up on something that one of the questioners asked. I mean, you've clearly stated that you're bullish on America's future prospects, that you're not somebody who sees the doom and gloom scenario playing out. The frame around entitlements and debt burdens, you think it's a flawed one. But what does concern you, if anything, as you look at the relationship between government and the country's success as we go forward? What are the things that are on your mind there?
What I am most concerned about is the decline in upward mobility and social mobility in the United States. I am concerned about the rise of economic inequality because I worry, and there's evidence for this worry, that when a society becomes too unequal, mobility is stalled. People's opportunities to rise go away. The best argument for government is John Stuart Mill's idea of help toward doing without help. And if you look at the history of government in the United States, it's been at its most successful and has succeeded when it gave people help to rise up themselves. And the societies that, our rate of social mobility is lower than that in quite a long list of industrial democracies, and they are all industrial democracies that are not as unequal as we are in terms of wages and incomes. I'm not a leveler. I don't think we can have a society where everybody earns the same thing, but we have gotten out of hand in terms of these inequalities, which in turn are getting in the way of mobility, which I think in turn is a much bigger long-term threat than so many of the things that probably that Bill would talk about. There are some things we agree on, but there are a bunch of things we disagree on there. I just want to close with two things. I want to defend the idea of our kids. I was very taken by that because Putnam's whole point is, of course, we are going to love and pay special attention to our own children. There'd be something terribly wrong with each of us if we didn't do that. But we have to think of all the kids in our society as fellow citizens, as future people who are going to build this country in the future, we do have to, in some way, think of our responsibility to those who can use some help. And I would close with my favorite line on politics and have and draw from that. My favorite line about politics is from the philosopher Michael Sandel, who many of you know. And Mike Sandel once said, when politics goes well, we can know a good in common that we cannot know alone. And the reason why I absolutely think you have to vote down this proposition is because I think it's also true that when government goes well, we can accomplish things in common that we cannot accomplish alone. Our history has proven that over and over again, and I think we would make a grave mistake if we forgot it. Thank you.
Bill, let me give you a final word here in response.
Well, I couldn't resist tweaking the "our kids" thing, because I knew that would get under EJ's skin, and he would give an eloquent...
It did.
It's good, and he would give an eloquent liberal defense of our common faith in our future concern for future generations and all that. Look, I don't disagree with Mike Sandel, but I would also say our society goes well when our government does not try to run every part of it, and when our government does well what it should do well, and those are a rather limited number of tasks. I would be, for me, it's less than the quantity, it's less than 20% than what government does and the way it does it. And I do think the wildly over-regulated nanny state, mishmash of responsibilities, lack of accountability, lack of being able to close down programs that aren't working, schools that aren't doing well, a lack of faith in parents in many cases, for example, in education, to choose better school, lack of not helping them choose better school for their kids. It just produces a less harmonious society. It produces more rancor. All this politicization, all the polarization, it's happened as the size of government has tended to increase, not decrease. Final point, but I agree on mobility. I mean, that is a real problem. I would argue, but look, Charles Murray, you mentioned Bob Putnam, I'll mention Charles Murray, and those two books are kind of bookends almost. They're not that dissimilar, I would say, in their presentation of the data. They come from a slightly different angle on it, but Murray's most recent book makes, I'll make this point, I won't put it in his, I don't know if he quite makes it this way. The upper middle class, who've done quite well, so nothing of the very wealthy, are very careful to select the services for their kids, the institutions for their kids, and they do not select, the public and government services because they really, have the ability and the knowledge and the wherewithal to really steer their kids in a way that they think will be successful. So we have then let, too often, the government services become the sort of place where the dysfunctional families and the kids who are much less in the way of opportunity go. That's not a healthy situation. But that's a situation that's partly come about because of, or in conjunction with, let's say, the growth of the welfare state. So it does require some radical rethinking. Some of that rethinking might include more of a role for government. I don't deny that, because we really do need to be, I might argue that big government has helped cause more family breakdown, but once it's broken down, you can't just say remove big government. So I take that point, and I think that's a serious challenge to conservatives today. What do you do about family breakdown, and does it require sometimes more government support for families or incentives for families to stay together, or at least be able to provide a decent life for their kids and so forth. But I do think it's not an accident that precisely the drop in mobility has happened not as government has gotten smaller, but as government has gotten bigger and more commanding, I think, of much of the society. And the one place there seems to be opportunity and a lot of mobility, and kids are making it without college degrees, and the immigrant kids are making it and stuff, is the least regulated parts of the economy. Silicon Valley, right? I mean, why, when you talk opportunity and mobility, you don't think, hey, let's go into a highly regulated, highly government-run part of the economy. You think, let's go out there to a place where you can actually make it on your own.
Please join me in giving Bill Kristol and E.J. Dionne a round of applause. You now have an opportunity to express your opinion through the same mechanism on your phone. GoVote.at with the number to express your preferences for or against the proposition, and being mindful of the quality of the exchange here and the arguments presented on both sides. We will, how quickly will we get the results back? Immediately, okay. So Who here has not yet cast a vote and still needs more time? Okay, we got a handful of folks.
Just remember the principle that I would say it here at the University of Chicago above all other places, that majority rule does not, decide questions.
I want to ask
questions of truth and falsity, questions of merit. Democracy is good for some things, but
While they're doing this, let me actually get a riff from each of you really quickly on this question of the declining faith we see in institutions, particularly in government. We've seen a lot of Pew research has sort of shared this. What's the secret to restoring that, the public faith in public institutions, do each of you think? EJ?
I mean, we've gone through a lot of tough times, and that we tend to blame public institutions when we go through tough times. If you just look at the first decade of this century, where we had 9/11, and we had a heroic response as a people to 9/11. Then we had the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, followed by the Iraq War. The latter, the former, I thought I supported. The latter, I didn't, and had a debate once with Bill where I said the difference between us is he thought it was World War II and I feared it was World War I in terms of weakening American power. And I'm afraid that that's what happened. And then we had this great economic crash, and we've had a series of problems over time that have weakened faith in public institutions. And the solution would be a period of good government, and a period where you saw, I think, something of, within the private sector as well, something of a greater spirit where you attend to the common good even as you are engaged in acts of enterprise. It is striking that we have the gaps between CEO pay and average wages. That wasn't because of government regulation. We lost some kind of internal restraints over a period, over a long period. So I think we need more public regarding institutions, including the private ones, and we need a successful period of government.
All right, we're going to show the results here in 1 second. Bill, anything you wanted to add to that?
I'll make a slightly contrarian point in 3 sentences, that I'm not so sure there's been such a dramatic decline. I mean, on the whole, the country's surprisingly healthy, given that we've gone through what EJ's gone through. There has not, politics you have pretty mainstream politicians, in truth, on both sides. You've had nothing in the way of what in America. Think of other tough periods in the country's history. Think of Joe McCarthy and George Wallace and Red Scares and kind of crazy demagoguery on both sides. And I would say we have not had much of that on either side. We've had a pretty tough partisan politics in an evenly divided country. But actually citizen participation went up, partly thanks to President Obama at first as a candidate, then to the Tea Party on the right. From my point of view as a Republican, there are a lot of very attractive young office holders who want to be president, who are young senators, congressmen. So I don't really quite buy the argument that our public life is suffering quite as much as some people think.
I welcome Bill Kristol's attack on McCarthyism.
All right, so we have our results here. There we go.
So this is when we came in, how many people agreed and disagreed with the statement, and then for the winning. So there was some flipping there.
You did all right.
Can't even interpret this.
I'll claim the victory.
I congratulate EJ on his hard-earned victory.
We have a year's supply of Jiffy Pop popcorn for you, EJ. EJ DeYoung, Bill Kristol, thank you both so much for this. Thank you all so much for being here, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow at the IOP House for Senator Bill Bradley. Have a safe evening, and thanks for being here.